Today's episode needs a bit of a warning. If you are falling asleep, tired, or just not up to your usual mental brilliance, then stop. Go get your coffee, go take a nap, do whatever you need to do to wake up, because things get a bit crazy today. Now, if you're like me, then up until where we are in the narrative today, there have probably been a few times you've been confused. You may have forgotten who's who at some point. Jenghis's family tree might look like a ball of yarn in your mind's eye. And yes, the story has been rather complicated, and then on top of all that, I am the one telling it, so if you have managed to follow along, good for you. But now, with today's content, things get insanely complicated. We've got it all. People who have the same names? Check. Characters who disappear for years and then return decades later? Check. Disappearances that lack any sort of explanation? Check. Families that are more dysfunctional than the government of Chicago? Check. So sit down. Tell the person next to you to shut up, put a second pot of coffee on, and let's get into this thing. Start the music. Welcome back to the Timur Podcast. My name is James, and I'm the guy who bombards you with confusing info as you and I go back to look at the man they call Timur. And our goals are to understand who he was, what he did, why he did it, and why does it matter. And guess what? Today's episode is our last and final introduction episode. In 7 days, Timur will be on the scene. I cannot believe we're nearly there. It's taken long enough. Yes, I know. But that being said, we do have one more episode to get through, and buckle in, man. When I research, I take notes, and then usually I'll go over my notes once or twice, and then I'll be ready to write up the episode. Not this time. This time I had to reread my notes 5 times. And no, that's not because of my atrocious handwriting. I don't appreciate you thinking that. But my notes have arrows all over them, making connections with pages that come before them, random highlighting. It's a mess. But I've done my best to go through these notes and make this episode as non-confusing as possible. And I don't know, that's all the prep I can give you before I push you into the deep end, so let's do this. As we went over many moons ago, Genghis Khan, upon creating his vast empire, gave his 4 favorite sons a different chunk of it. To his second son Chagatai, he gave the land that would soon be called the Chagatai Khanate. Today, this area would roughly correlate to western China, southern Kazakhstan, parts of Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Geographically speaking, this was a territory of vast plains and steppe, with mountains, lakes, and rivers dissecting it, and then with rich and powerful cities dotted about, especially in the western portion. Culturally speaking, this land had a whole lot of different people. The settled people in the cities and rural areas tended to be Turk or Persian Muslims. Then hordes of nomadic tribes traveled around the pastures and steppe, and these tribes were usually composed of pagan or Nestorian Christian Mongols, with some Turks intermingled with them. That is probably the largest oversimplification you've heard yet on this show, but what's important for us is to realize that that I can't talk, A. B, there's a cultural divide between nomadic and settled peoples living in the same areas, and C, there's also a pretty big religious divide between these same groups. But don't worry, I'm sure neither of these things will cause problems for the Chagatai Khanate further on down the road. Oh, what's that? They caused problems almost immediately? Well, okay then, we've got problems almost immediately. As we went over way back in episode 1, as Genghis Khan conquered new regions, he would often reward certain obedient followers of his by giving them land or authority. Oh, you gave troops to my son? Well, you can now be the governor of some city. Oh, you defeated one of my enemies? Well, now your tribe can have this whole region to graze and live on, things like that. This is what he did with the land he conquered in Central Asia. Then Genghis headed east to attack the Chinese, which we covered way back, yes, but he left certain Mongols in charge of what would later become the Chagatai Khanate. And these Mongols just totally took advantage of the native Turks and Persians and other people living here. Muslims were persecuted, taxes were raised, and an already desperate population who had just barely survived the wrath of Genghis's invasion has to suffer more. There's widespread corruption, there's murder and pillaging, and the people here understandably can talk better than I can, and they really start to hate their Mongol overlords. And this is when Genghis sends his son Chagatai to sort everything out. Look, Chagatai, you can have all this land, but you've got to punish the corrupt guys I put there. You got to make sure the people keep paying their taxes. And actually, I'm going to make you the keeper of the Yasa, which is the keeper of the old Mongolian ways and laws, a huge and widely respected title. So Chagatai now goes to this land well equipped to deal with the problems, and this land would soon become known as the Chagatai Khanate, named after him. This was the year 1227. The same year, Genghis Khan died. And then his son Ogadai became the new great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Again, we covered most of this way back, but here's a little review. Despite the brothers not exactly trusting or liking one another, Chagatai was actually totally fine that his little bro got the job instead of him as the great Khan. After all, Chagatai had all this great land he was now in charge of. He was the keeper of the Yasa, and sure, he had to bend the knee to Ogadai, but in his own land, he was pretty much the sole ruler. Now, Chagatai is what we would call an old Mongol, a man who was truly his father's son, a man who was battle-hardened on the steppe and remembered it, a man who hadn't been spoiled by luxuries, a man who remembered the old gods and the old ways, but he also wasn't a dummy. He knew that he had to make some compromises in order to keep at least most of the people under him content. So Chagatai comes in and he tells the other Mongol lords to knock off persecuting the Muslims. We need to be tolerant of them. But he also makes it clear that the Yasa, that is the old Mongolian law, is superior to Muslim Sharia law every hour of every day of the week. But if Muslims are content with that, then great, they're allowed to worship as they please. He even appointed several administrators who were Muslim. He was generally very tolerant of them. Chagatai certainly preferred shamanism and Christianity, but hey, most of his people were Muslim, so he made things work. And honestly, he was too busy to spend much time thinking about religion in the first place. He was always having to send more troops off to aid the never-ending wars in China. He was always putting down various rebellions and conspiracies against him in his own land, things like that. But generally, during his reign as Khan, from the year 1227 until 1242, things were generally sort of fine. And as you and I know by now, generally sort of fine is pretty darn good for Mongolian rule. But then Chagatai died. His son was supposed to take the throne after him, but his son had died in a siege years before. So his son, that is Chagatai's grandson, took the throne of the Chagatai Khanate. And this was a man by the name of Kara Hulagu. Not Hulagu, the guy we talked about over in the Ilkhanate, but Kara Hulagu. And just wait, the name situation is going to get so much better. Anyway, the thing about Kara Hulagu was that he was only a child. So while the boy is growing up, the realm is ruled by various administrators and the Queen Regent, Queen Abuskan. And this goes on for a few years, but remember that this Khanate, and its Khan, is still servant to the Mongol Empire and the Great Khan, the Khan of Khans. And the Great Khan of the entire Mongol Empire is now Guyuk Khan, and he's got plans for the Chagatai Khanate. He removes the child Khan Kara Hulagu, he's just a kid, he's not much use to me anyway, and he replaces him with a personal friend, a man named Yesu Monk. Now, don't forget Kara Hulagu, he'll be back, but for now, in the year 1246, Yesu Monk is the Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, which isn't great. Yesu Monk is a heavy alcoholic who prefers to spend most of his time partying and drinking instead of running the empire, which he leaves to his diligent wife and various state ministers to do for him. But if there's one thing drunk men love to do, it's war. And with the great Khan Guyuk's death in 1248, the Mongol Empire goes through a few years of uncertainty, and then there's this coup against the ruling house of Ogadai by some guy named Monk. But Yesu Monk, the guy ruling the Chagatai Khanate, he decides to side with the house of Ogadai. So, okay, Yesu Monk, the Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, is opposing Monk, who's claiming to be the next great Khan. There's two monks here. Don't you just love these names? Anyway, as we covered episodes ago, the coup works and Monk Khan becomes the fourth great Khan of the Mongol Empire. And Monk Khan is not too happy with Yesu Monk of the Chagatai Khanate. So Monk orders that Yesu Monk be executed for opposing him, and this is done. Monk then sends Karahulagu, remember that child who was already Khan but too young to actually rule, who I told you to remember? Well, Monk sends him back to rule the Chagatai Khanate now that he's old enough. And then, to make all of this more complicated, Karahulagu dies on the way from China to the Chagatai Khanate in the year 1252. Okay, are you with me? Take a deep breath. So the throne of the Chagatai Khanate now goes to Karahulagu's son, named Mubarak Shah. Now, Mubarak Shah, following in his dad's footsteps, is too young to rule. So Karahulagu's widow, the widow Organa, becomes queen regent of the Khanate from 1252 to about 1260 or 1261. And Queen Organa is described as a wise, discerning, and stunningly beautiful woman who made sure that things in the realm functioned as they were supposed to. And then there was peace during her reign. There was peace for a while. And then there was not peace. In the year 1260, Monk Khan died, which, as we covered, led to an empire-wide civil war between Monk's two brothers, Kublai and Erik Bok. And Erik Bok really wants the Chagatai Khanate on his side. He needs all the help he can get to fight Kublai. So Erik Bok sends one of his supporters and a grandson of Chagatai, a man named Algu, to take over the Chagatai Khanate, put things in order, raise troops, and then hurry back to help against Kublai. So Algu heads on over to the Chagatai Khanate. He finds the Queen Regent Organa ruling there. He removes her from power, sends her away. She'll be back. But Algu has different plans than what his supposed superior Erik Bok had sent him to do. Algu wants to be his own ruler and servant to nobody. So taking advantage of the civil war, Algu turns on his former master Erik Bok, kills his tax collectors and his messengers, and then allies with Kublai. As you can expect, this kind of makes Erik Bok mad. So he pauses his war with Kublai to go deal with this traitor. Erik Bok and Algu face off in battle, and Algu actually wins. Drunk with a victory, though, Algu thinks to himself, job well done. He goes home, he disbands his army, he throws a party, and relaxes. Meanwhile, Erik Bok has escaped, he's licked his wounds, he's gathered a new army, and he's returned. And Algu has no army. So Algu flees to the city of Samarkand in the year 1263. Erik Bok then goes ravaging through the countryside of Transoxiana, causing so much death and misery that supposedly even some of his own men deserted him in disgust. But meanwhile, Algu is licking his wounds and raising a new army of his own. The two men meet again in battle, and Algu defeats Erik Bok. Erik Bok decides that peace is the best option, so he sends the former Queen Regent of the Chagatai Khanate, Queen Organa, to go to Algu to talk about peace. This is done, peace is established between Algu and Erik Bok, and then Algu marries Queen Organa. I told you she'd be back. Anyway, soon thereafter, and probably because of this in a lot of ways, Erik Bok surrenders to Kublai Khan in the year 1264, bringing the Toluid Civil War to an end and leaving Algu as the Khan of the Chagatai Khanate. But not for long, because Algu dies the very next year in 1265, leaving Queen Organa as Queen Regent of a dead Khan for the second time. And now her son Mubarak Shah is old enough to actually take the throne, so that's what happens. Mubarak Shah becomes the new Chagatai Khan in the year 1266, and by this time in history, actually for a couple of years now, the Chagatai Khanate is pretty much its own empire. And Queen Organa got her wish after years of political games, multiple marriages, and court intrigue. She got her wish. Her son Mubarak Shah is on the throne, and things look good. But not for long, because Mubarak Shah, the current Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, has a cousin, a man by the name of Ghiyas-ud-Din Barak, or simply Barak. And Barak goes to Kublai and says, "Hey, Kublai, I know you don't really have control of the Chagatai Khanate, but wouldn't it be nice if you did? So here's the deal. If you give me your blessing, I'll go take the Khanate from my cousin, and then I'll totally be loyal to you." So Kublai figures, why not? And Barak does just this. He goes to the Chagatai Khanate, he removes his cousin from power, and reduces him to the position of master of the royal hunt, which is a polite way of saying, I'm in charge now, stay out of my way. But here's the thing. Surprise, surprise, Barak has his own ideas about ruling. He wants to be his own Khan and not servant to anybody, just like Algu had wanted years before. And what's more, Barak even starts arguing with Kublai, like right away, about who owns the Tarim Basin in western China. And then Barak sends an army in, sacks a few of Kublai's cities, and it doesn't look good between these two men. Kublai sends 6,000 horsemen there to, sort of enforce the border, see what's going on, and Barak meets these with 30,000 of his own men. Thankfully, both sides withdraw without a battle, but now it's out in the open that Barak and Kublai are pretty much at war. But as we're going to see a few times in this episode, and probably a few times with Timur in the future, the land of the Chagatai Khanate is a lot like Poland. Now bear with me. The history of the Chagatai Khanate is a history of being surrounded by greedy and powerful nations. So while Barak is facing off with Kublai on the eastern border, things aren't looking good on his western border, because once again, the Mongol Empire is in another civil war, this time between Kublai and Kaidu. We covered that a few episodes back, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But Kaidu, at this point, has already been gathering support in parts of Mongolia, and he's also allied with the Golden Horde Khanate, and now he wants to subjugate the Chagatai Khanate before moving on to Kublai in China. So Kaidu and the Golden Horde invade Barak's flank with 50,000 men, they crush his forces, and Barak flees. After retreating, Barak then sacks two of his own cities, the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, in order to get enough money to get another army to hopefully repel these invaders. But just then, Kaidu sends word to Barak with the message, "Hey, I've got an idea. You're finished, we've won, so you can either continue to resist us and we will kill you, or you can surrender, you can become my vassal, and look, if you give me some of your lands and bend the knee, I will let you remain the ruler of Transoxiana." Given his desperate situation, Barak heartily agrees to the proposal and gives most of the Khanate to the direct control of Kaidu. But hey, for Barak, at least he's alive and still in control of something. But Kaidu doesn't really trust Barak, and this was probably wise. Barak had just stabbed Kublai in the back. So Kaidu gives Barak a job, a test maybe. Leave your land, gather your armies, and attack my enemy the Ilkhanate. Because remember, the Ilkhanate had sided with Kublai in this civil war. So Barak agrees and he invades the Ilkhanate, but not before sacking again his own cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. Now that he has enough resources, he invades the Ilkhanate, and things go well for him, actually. He plunders his way through the region of Khorasan, he defeats the brother of the Ilkhanate, Ilkhan, the ruler of the Ilkhanate, defeats his brother, but this gets the attention of the Ilkhan, who at this time is the Ilkhan Abaka, and Abaka decides enough is enough. He marches to meet Barak in battle, and absolutely crushes him on July 22nd, 1270. So once again, Barak is on the run. But this time, while he's fleeing, he falls off of his horse, he's crippled, and so when he gets home, he begs Kaidu, please send help, this thing isn't going too well. So Kaidu hears this and decides to come in person with 20,000 troops. According to legend, Barak fell down dead in shock when he saw Kaidu approaching with this many men, but it's more likely that Kaidu had Barak secretly murdered. To Kaidu, Barak was untrustworthy, unreliable, and had just been defeated by Kaidu's enemies, so Barak needed to go. So Barak is dead, and this left all of the Chagatai Khanate firmly in the control of Kaidu, who can now focus all of his attention on defeating Kublai and taking the whole Mongol Empire for himself. But surprise, surprise, not everybody is happy with this arrangement. Barak had 4 sons, and all of them are pissed that Kaidu humiliated and maybe even killed their dad. So these brothers join up and rebel against Kaidu. And these 4 guys are joined by the 2 sons of Algu. Remember him way back there? So it's now this 6-son alliance of long-deceased Chagatai Khans versus Kaidu. But Kaidu just mops the floor of them, defeating them in battle again and again and again. But this is not what Kaidu wants to be doing. He wants to be fighting Kublai. So he puts a Chagatai prince named Negube in charge as the new Chagatai Khan and says, look, put things back in order for me, stabilize this troublesome area so I can focus on Kublai. Negube does this by not doing this at all. He promptly rebels against Kaidu. So Kaidu marches all the way back, he defeats Negube, he executes him, and then he puts a new guy named Tuka Temur on the throne of the Chagatai Khanate. Tuka Temur rules from about 1272 until 1282. And during his reign, the leader of the Ilkhanate, Ilkhan Abaka, again invades the Chagatai Khanate in revenge for them invading him years earlier. The Ilkhan Abaka sacks the cities of Urgench and Khiva, he ravages the region of Horizm, and takes 50,000 slaves off back to Persia. In addition to this, rebellions are always popping up in the Chagatai Khanate. There are rebels who want to break off and join the Ilkhanate, there are rebels who want to join the Golden Horde, there are rebels who want to be autonomous on their own, and there are a bunch of rebels who want to be ruled by the family of Barak because, hey, at least Barak cared about the Chagatai Khanate first and foremost. So Kaidu is just not going to catch a break with the Chagatai Khanate. And he's just sick of this whole situation, and so he goes to the Chagatai Khanate and says, fine, you know what? If you want a son of Barak to rule you, you can have a son of Barak. So Kaidu appoints one of Barak's sons, a man named Duwa, as the new Chagatai Khan. Duwa, despite being a son of Barak, had actually been a loyal commander and friend under Kaidu, so for Kaidu this was an obvious solution. Now, Duwa will be with us for a while, so remember that name. He will rule the Chagatai Khanate from 1282 until 1307, so like 25 years. During this time, Duwa remains loyal to Kaidu, and the two try to invade China a few times, but are generally repulsed every time. But now we have to look at another interesting part of the geography of the Chagatai Khanate, an aspect that will definitely play a part in the story of Timur much further on down the road. And that is that the land of the Chagatai Khanate borders India. India was never conquered by the Mongol Empire, but its lands are rich, it has huge cities, tons of potential slaves and riches, and as such, the rulers of the Chagatai Khanate were always sending raiding parties, slaving parties, and sometimes just full-out invasions into the Indian subcontinent. And in 1295, Duwa leads an invasion of India and just devastates the region north of Delhi. Invading India will become a trend of the Chagatai leaders, and Timur will also follow this trend decades later. Anyway, most of the sources tend to agree that Duwa was a fantastic and skilled leader, and wow, he actually stays loyal to his superior Kaidu throughout his whole reign. And things go well for the two at first. In 1298, Duwa actually defeats one of Kublai's armies. Although at this point, Kublai is dead, and it's his grandson Timur, who's the new Khan and emperor of the Yuan dynasty. But Duwa defeats the army, he captures one of Kublai's son-in-laws, and then executes this guy, which is a clear victory. But then another imperial army of the Yuan dynasty catches up with Duwa and defeats him, forcing him to retreat. Now, at this point, Kaidu has been fighting in this civil war for nearly 30 years. And so he decides to take a final gamble and push all of his chips into the table. He and Duwa will throw everything they have to take the heartland of Mongolia and the city of Karakorum, thus hopefully signaling their supremacy to all of the Mongol leaders. So they begin this invasion, and it just goes terribly, about as terribly as invasions can go. They're defeated in battle several times, there's terrible weather, Kaidu is killed during a retreat, Duwa is wounded, and he's forced to go running back home to the Chagatai Khanate. Now, I'm gonna pause here. Let's put these wars on hold and zoom into the lives of the people of the Chagatai Khanate real quick. These wars are being carried out mostly by the nomadic population, which means that the cities are constantly being heavily taxed to pay for the wars, or, just as we saw with Barak, just outright sacked by their own leaders in order to get as many resources for the war as possible. And also keep in mind that this whole area was still trying to recover from the initial Mongol invasion like 100 years prior. So the city folk are really getting tired of their nomadic rulers. So just keep that in mind. While the Chagatai Khanate isn't really doing too great on the macro political scene, it's also really starting to collapse on the micro cultural and political areas. Okay, back to Duwa. He's still in charge, and even though his master Kaidu is dead, he remains loyal to him. He names Kaidu's son Chapar as the rightful heir, gives him territories, his inheritance, troops, etc., but both Chapar and Duwa know that the war against Temur Khan and the Yuan dynasty, it's pretty much lost. So they wisely surrender and submit to Temur Khan in the year 1303, bringing the whole Mongol Empire together for one final gasp of unified air. But Duwa isn't done with his ambitions. He wants more. He invades India again in the year 1303, taking as much spoil and slaves as he can carry, and then he does this again in 1304, but this still isn't big enough. So, in 1306, Duwa attacks Chapar. Yes, the son of Kaidu, who he had just put in power and sworn allegiance to. Yeah, that Chapar. Duwa betrays him and then invades his lands. So the two men meet in battle. Duwa wins. But then Chapar's brother comes with another army and defeats Duwa. So Duwa says, Hey guys, I know I totally turned on you and am not reliable in the least, but what do you say we let bygones be bygones and return to our peaceful alliance? Let's get together and talk this thing out. So Chapar agrees to this, and he sends his brother to talk to Duwa at a peace conference. And Duwa promptly ambushes him, defeats his army, and says that there is no chance for peace. There never was. Meanwhile, Temur Khan of the Yuan dynasty is coming with his own army to put things back in order. Timur Khan flanks Chapar, Chapar surrenders, and Duwa is left once again as the sole ruler of the Chagatai Khanate. The year is 1306, and after all of that backstabbing and treachery, Duwa finally has what he always wanted, a unified Chagatai Khanate all to himself. And then he dies the very next year in 1307, which I think serves him right. His son Konchek then takes the throne, rules for a year and a half, and then he dies. Then a man named Taliku seizes the Chagatai throne, but he's not just a nobody, he was the brother of Tuka Temur, the Khan of the Chagatai Khanate years earlier from 1272 until 1282, before Duwa was made Khan. I told you this was confusing. So, Taliku is now the Khan, and he is a staunch Muslim, and he also wants everybody in his realm to become Muslims, including the old Mongolian aristocracy. Well, the old Mongolian aristocracy hates this idea, so they ally with the family of Duwa, and this new alliance then assassinates the Khan Taliku at a banquet. So now the Khanship of the Chagatai Khanate then goes back to Duwa's family, who's back in control. Duwa's son, Quebec, becomes the new Khan in the year 1309. And then Chapar comes back. Remember Chapar, the son of Kaidu who Duwa helped and then betrayed? Well, yeah, he's back now, and he wants his rightful ownership of the throne that his father Kaidu had. But then he's defeated by Quebec, and that's that. But this sort of unnerves Quebec and some of his supporters as well, so they decide to hold a Kurultai in order to talk about things and figure out where to go next. The group decides that Quebec's brother S1Buka would be a better fit as ruler, so Quebec willingly steps down for the good of the realm, and S1Buka becomes the new Khan of the Chagatai Khanate. S1Buka rules from 1310 until 1318, and his reign is troubled at best. He tries to expand the Chagatai Khanate into eastern Afghanistan, but this brings the attention of the Ilkhanate, and they don't like that their neighbor is expanding here because the Ilkhanate is allied to western Afghanistan. So the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate go to war yet again, and Esenbuka does manage to defeat an Ilkhanate army, but this gets the attention of the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty sends an imperial army to attack Esenbuka's flank. Again, one of the biggest problems for the Chagatai Khanate is that it's surrounded by powerful enemies, and as soon as they have one on the run, another attacks in their flank. Anyway, in 1315, things get even worse for Esenbuka. A Chagatai prince named Yasaur rebels against him, allies with the Ilkhanate, and begins gobbling up parts of the Chagatai Khanate from within. And then this Yasaur turns on his Ilkhanate allies almost as soon as he made them, and so the whole realm is thrown into chaos as if it wasn't already. Then, in the year 1318, the Khan Esenbuka dies, and his brother Quebec becomes Khan again for the second time, inheriting it from his brother. And Quebec's second reign goes much better than his first. He allies with his enemies, the Ilkhanate, to take out this upstart Yasaur who has pissed them both off, and this goes well. Yasaur is defeated by 1320, and the Ilkhanate and Chagatai Khanate are at peace. Then Quebec goes to the Yuan dynasty and makes peace with them. And for the first time in a long time, there is peace, and you can see the seeds of prosperity being planted in the Chagatai Khanate. To push this further, Quebec also establishes a capital city, something that amazingly hadn't been done yet because his nomadic predecessors preferred to be the capital themselves as a person. Wherever they happened to be, they were the capital of the realm. But now there's an actual city of the Chagatai Khanate situated at Karshi in modern-day Western China. And I'm probably saying that wrong, along with every other word I'm saying in this podcast. I apologize again. I'm pretty bad at pronunciation. Anyway, Quebec also builds palaces. He promotes a stable currency later called Quebeci after him. And Quebec, while he didn't become a Muslim, he promoted religious tolerance. It was generally a good time for the Khanate and the people within it getting along. But all good things must come to an end, and Quebec Khan died in 1325, leaving the realm to his oldest son. A name that I'm not going to even try to say. It's spelled Eligidai, but it doesn't matter because the son would die within a year. So the throne goes to Quebec's second son, Duwa Timur, who also dies within a year. But the third son is the charm, and the third son, Tarmashiran, would take the Chagatai throne in the year 1326. Tarmashiran began his reign by driving his forces deep into India, raiding, plundering yet again, and he actually made it to the gates of Delhi itself and only left after demanding huge sums of gold. But on the home front, things once again were not too great. Tarmashiran became a Muslim, changed his name to Sultan Allah ad-Din, and began talking about how everybody in his realm should be made to become a Muslim, including the old Mongolian aristocracy. And the old Mongolian aristocracy didn't love this. So in the year 1333 or 1334, a coup breaks out, Tarmashiran was deposed, and a Khan who preferred shamanism and Christianity and the old ways was put in his place. This man was named Jiangxi, and he was a grandson of that guy Duwa we talked about earlier. Aren't these family feuds fun? You're never truly rid of anybody. Anyway, so Jiangxi is the new Khan, and he rules from 1334 until 1338, and then he's murdered. Murdered by his own brother, Yesun Temur. Yesun Temur becomes the new Khan and rules for 4 years, but his whole reign is plagued with guilt for killing his brother. He throws fits, blaming his mother for making him do it. He becomes a heavy drinker, he's always sulking, and then he dies in 1342. Next up is Khan Ali Sultan. He tries persecuting non-Muslims, and then he dies within a year. After this is Muhammad I ibn Pulad. He dies after about a year by 1343. And this is where our story enters the next stage. The year is 1343. The Chagatai Khanate is in turmoil as religious and cultural differences are pulling whole populations apart, and then amid this political upheavals, our topic from last week appears: the Black Death. It hits Central Asia, and it hits hard. Suddenly the focus of the people shifts from reforming the power dynamic or whatever to simply survival. And among this catastrophic amount of death, the Chagatai Khanate breaks in half. The western half was predominantly Muslim. Most of its rulers were Turkish, and while there certainly were large groups of nomads living here, it also had a huge population of city dwellers scattered throughout the various cities of the region, such as Bukhara and Samarkand. In contrast, the eastern half was primarily pagan or Nestorian Christian, largely Mongolian, and predominantly nomadic as a lifestyle. Oh god, they're coming for me. And this rift between these two halves, these two different groups of people, has only been growing, leading finally to this point, the breaking point. The western half of the Chagatai Khanate is usually simply referred to as Transoxiana, and in 1343, a man by the name of Kazan ibn Yasur seizes the throne. And he was the son of Yasa-ur, that guy who rebelled back both against Quebec and the Ilkhanate a few years earlier. Again, everyone has some ridiculous claim to the throne. Anyway, Khan Kazan had his hands full with just Transoxiana. His people and his cities were in shambles from the Black Death, and the leaders of both the nomadic tribes and the cities were itching for their own autonomy away from this Khan system of rule. We're just done with that. But what this meant for Kazan is that he could give no attention to the eastern half of his empire that was breaking away. This eastern half would become known as Mogulistan, and by the mid-1340s, Mogulistan had broken off to the point that they were pretty much independent, and the Chagatai Khanate was no more. Mogulistan was ruled in the old Mongolian way by various nomadic tribes and families, the most powerful being the Duklat family, and eventually these tribes decided to hold a Kurultai to elect their new leader, a new Khan. And they found a man living in relative obscurity named Tugla Timur. And he was supposedly the son of S1Buka, the Khan of the Chagatai Khanate years before. Now, this isn't our Timur, it's just another guy with the same name. Now, what it does mean is that Tugla Timur has a pretty good claim to the Chagatai family line, and indeed to what was the former Chagatai Khanate if he is the descendant of S1Buka. But for now, the year is 1343. The Chagatai Khanate is no more, but it is now Transoxiana in the west, ruled by Khan Kazan, and Mogulistan in the east, ruled by a system of families, but soon to be Khan Tugla Timur. We're here. We finally made it. We are at the story of Timur. If you're familiar with Timur's story, then you're probably aware that he's actually already alive at this point, most likely. One of the traditional years of his birth is the year 1336, which means that he's about 7 years old or so by the year 1343, which is where we're stopping this episode. Because next week is where it all begins for Timur, and Khan Kazan and Khan Tugla Timur are going to directly impact the life of this young boy. And with that, that's the end of today's episode. We've finally made it through the introduction episodes, and next week, Timur will be here and will actually start this investigation. Next week's episode will cover the birth and early life of Timur, as well as the politics that surround that. But here's the thing, I will also be releasing another episode. So 2 episodes will be released next Thursday. We'll have the normal episode, but I will also be releasing a short, probably 10 to 15 minute recap of everything we've looked at from episode 1 through today, because I know it's a lot. Not everything I've brought up is essential to understand the story of Timur, but some of it is. So for my own sake and for your sake and for anyone new who might be joining us next week, this recap episode should be helpful. Again, it'll be short, it'll be kind of to the point, but it'll be a nice way to just remember where we are in this story and really set the stage for Timur. As always, if you have any questions, comments, songs you've written, feel free to reach out to me for any reason at any time. You can email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com, follow me on Twitter at podcasttimur, or on Facebook at timurpod. Hearing from you is literally my favorite thing about podcasting, so do not hesitate to reach out. But with all that said, I will see you right here next week for the birth of Timur, right here on the Timur Podcast.